Slide beneath me, slide above. I had just got done watching a bit of clips from Fern Gully, so y'all excuse me. You know, the rental car industry is something we do not talk about. And of course, as always, I want to talk about it. So check this. I had no idea that the rental car industry was so intertwined with the automotive industry. And I know that sounds crazy to say, but looking back at the history, oh, it goes there. What's up, guys? My name is Chris, and welcome to The Breakdown, where we talk about everything cars, news, and reviews. If you're new to the channel, welcome. If you're not, welcome back. So the thing is that I have always had a bit of a relationship with the rental car industry alongside the automotive industry. If you don't know, I used to work for a rental car company, and dear God. We're not going to talk about what happened, but it always made me a bit curious of why there were so many General Motors, Fords, and Chrysler cars. And I have to tell you, the lore is there. So with that being said, in today's video, we will be talking about the very curious but interesting story behind rental car companies, American car companies, as well as the relationship between them and why the car industry would not be here without them. So with that being said, stick around and stay tuned because you are now watching The Breakdown. Now, I think we all have had some type of rental car story where it was an absolute nightmare, but it didn't used to always be that way. In fact, franchises as a recent thing have probably been around since around the 1960s, but it goes so much further back than that. You see, the story starts back as early as 1906, and even then there was always some level of skepticism, but the way that the rental car industry started is definitely out of a solution from a problem. So I'm going to place the year roughly around 1915, and Joe Saunders is out driving with his wife, and so basically what happens is his car breaks down, and what ends up happening is his car is out of commission for a while, and he's got to go find a car because he is apparently a struggling real estate business person. And because of that, he decided that he was going to go rent a car because why not? It was only the early 1900s. Basically, the way that it goes is that he was a person who was always looking at a bit of a business opportunity. And for context, he had a real estate business with his brothers, and apparently his dad was not pleased when he found out that shortly after renting a car that Joe would eventually go start his own rental car business. It was basically like 3 Model T Fords, and they were all being rented out. The crazy thing is that not only was he handling the books in the back, but he also was doing the wrench, clink, clink, clack, clack on the cars themselves. And that's back when you could work on Model T Fords and not break them, because today you couldn't dare do that. Good luck. I don't even like to do oil changes, so there's that. But, and before y'all start to clown me, I actually do and have been working on cars for years, probably the bulk of my life. So before you start talking shit on the other end, just remember, I know how to change brake pads. And by 1918, business is booming. The people wanted rental cars. And I think it makes a lot of sense because back then, cars were relatively fresh. You know, they weren't really a thing. And it's funny because even though Saunders was one of the first people to create a rental car company, it actually was Sixt, which I had no idea about. And I used to work at the airport in Hartsfield, and I always thought Sixt was like a newer car company. And I always thought that Sixt was like a newer age rental car company because I never heard about it, because the only thing we hear about is Hertz and Enterprise, which I will get to later in the story. But Sixt was actually one of the first car rental companies ever, and is surprisingly German, which I also didn't know. Now, the name of this rental car fleet system was called the Saunders system, and it was ran by his 4 brothers and his dad. And of course, there was competition, and Walter Jacobs was looking to the side like, hey, what y'all got going on over there? And Walters is one of the more curious pieces of this entire puzzle, because without him, we don't have a very special car company that you all know about. Now, the interesting thing about Walter Jacobs, especially considering the time, was that he was creating his business in 1918, but he did it at the age of 22. One of the first YouTubers. I'm kidding, it's a running joke today. But he was one of the first people to have a rental car fleet of his own at 22. Now, where he got the capital from, I don't know. But his efforts were so successful that he ended up growing his fleet of 12 to 565 and revenuing over $1 million in 1 year. Again, This was 1923. Now, the system was called the drive yourself system and basically was a way for people to get into cars very accessibly. And this is also during the time where ownership is a really big deal. Now, keep in mind, we're about 7 years before the Great Depression, but business is booming, babe. So much so that John D. Hertz caught eye of it and took it from Jacobs. And he said, yeah, hand that over. And this would be the first time we would hear the phrase rent a car, because he changed the phrase from rent a Ford to rent a car. So already in the earlier days of rental car madness, you already see Ford and business people's business. Now, John Hertz would eventually sell off shares to General Motors, and then they would get into it. Now, the curious thing about this is that the entire rental car system is not profitable for most of these car companies, but it was as they were growing. Now, I do like how John D. Hertz was able to double dip. Even though he sold shares to General Motors, he was able to double dip and still operate as a consultant for General Motors. And this would go on from 1926 to 1953. And he would eventually use the Omnibus Corporation to buy some shares back, but the back and forth between Hertz is very much interesting. Now, in between that time, we're roughly between 1926 and 1953, and a few things happen. Now, the curious thing is that even though we're going through the Great Depression, it doesn't take that much off of the rental business. You know, people are still like, oh, I still need to go do what I need to do. Of course, towards the 40s, we have to start shrinking back and peeling back because the military needs to use all the resources, and the rental car companies had to also scale back. One of the things they had to do was they had to retread them tires. They was like, baby, go ahead and put them leftovers on the stove. Now, I didn't really get into the understanding of products in my research because this can be a bit exhausting in terms of just absorbing the information because there's literally so much. But the thing is that during the 40s, it's almost like it happens overnight. And in between the year of 1940 to 1945, we all know that World War II happens, and of course it ends. Well, after it ends is when the big boom happens. And after the big boom happens, people have a sudden influx of money. More people are leaving the city to go to suburbs, and the travel ways for the highways have definitely gotten better. Now, keep in mind that it's still some shenanigans going on between Ford and General Motors, but one of the most important things that happens during this time is that Avis comes out with the Avis rental car company, and that is out of another solution to a problem. So the way that the story goes is that basically he got tired of waiting around at the airports for taxis, and by he, Warren E. Avis, took $10,000 of his own money, $10,000 of his own money to start these rental car companies. And the big question around the airports was, well, where are you going to store the cars and how are we going to get back and forth? It was very much like, I'm sorry, what are you talking about? And because of that, he was able to create a system that worked. And after a few years, and once they got it off the ground, it was very efficient. Now, he did sell it off, and I think it was just out of concern of how much he got bored with it. But Warren Avis was very much like, hey, we need to make this thing pop. And apparently he had a lot of different businesses, and he took some of that money to create some of the other businesses. But from that time on, it was not uncommon to see a lot of American car companies to put into the rental car business. Now, the one car company that did not participate in this just yet was Chrysler. But of course, like in today's presentation, I'm gonna get to that later down the story. So the interesting thing is that around 1946, after Warren E. Avis starts out the airport, everybody else got to have an airport rental. And so Hertz decided that they was going to have the same thing and create the fly drive out system, which would be in places like Atlanta and Milwaukee. And everybody had to participate in the industry of rental cars because it was booming. And it became to a point where less and less people wanted to own cars, and it became a little passe, if you will. It's like, I don't really want to own a car. It's a bit above me now. But over time, you begin to see a lot more car companies intertwine with the relationship of the car industry, but also the travel industry. Now, what made the rental car business really boom was around the 1950s. So a few things happened. One of them being that Hertz decides that instead of just focusing on the airports, we're going to focus on local markets. And the idea sounded crazy at the time. And the Lehman Brothers partly backed this, and this is how you get the independent franchisee stores that you see today. Because apparently they decided it would be cheaper to license it out instead of just letting, having their own stores. We even see things like that today with McDonald's, and many companies have gotten to the point where now we start to see a lot more businesses license out and franchise out. I don't necessarily know if they were the sole reason behind that, but the reason why you see a lot of the independent rental stores today that aren't necessarily owned by the corporation, but they are using the same name. And that's the reason why, because Hertz started that. Now, one of the things that I didn't know was that when Jack Taylor first came back from the military, he decided that he wanted to start a business. And part of the reason why the Enterprise name exists is because it's actually a salute to the USS Enterprise. I had no idea. The other cool connection between that is that Jack Taylor was a decorated Hellcat fighter. And if you guys didn't know, the reason why the Hellcat is called that is because it is an OD to the Hellcat fighters back in the early 40s, and Dodge took that name and applied it to the Hellcat moniker. So it's very interesting how all of this ties together. I am going to say this is that Enterprise gave a bit of a different flair to the rental car industry, but more importantly, we start to see a lot more other car companies enter into the game. So apparently Toyota entered the rental car business roughly around the 60s, and they didn't hit the States till the 90s, which Mitsubishi actually was one of the first foreign imports to come in under Thrifty, and I'll get to that in just a second. But they were not doing rentals like the Americans were, and partly that's because of the big boom. Enterprise starts in 1957, and one of their big things is that they are going to change the way that the rental cars are done, especially in the home market. And that's why you see a bit of a different experience, because Hertz is very old, and they also give that old energy because they have been around for so many years. Now, it was a back and forth. At one point, Ford owned some shares into Hertz, and then General Motors owned some shares into Hertz, and then somebody owned some more shares into Avis. And of course, there were so many rental car companies, and a lot of them did not make it. And common practice actually before the 50s was that you did not use credit or debit. And I will put an article below from 1962 explaining all of this. But basically back then, in the early days of the car rental industry, you didn't use credit, you used cash. And so we didn't start to see credit and debit later on into the series. But throughout all of this, these car companies are booming and they're really taking off. Now, what makes this also very interesting is that these rental car fleets were not really used until the latter part of the 80s to push out a lot of the excess inventory that the American car companies is making. Now, Chrysler didn't enter into the rental car business till the 80s because they was like, we ain't doing that. It's a waste of money. And partly because Lee Iacocca, who comes up a lot of my stories, he was really big on, I think it's a waste of money. I don't understand why y'all are doing it. This is stupid. But he couldn't resist the opportunity because a lot of car makers found it to be not necessarily profitable, but to remain competitive. And both General Motors and Chrysler definitely dealt with overcapacity of production. And so they had to find somewhere to put their cars. And so that's how we began to get more and more rental fleets out there. Ford also is a part of that. And I believe they took over Hertz as a part of their fleet to push out more. And that's also why for 16 years, up until about 2005, you see a lot more Fords as rental cars. Now, of course, like I said, Toyota didn't really enter into the 90s. Honda for a long time did not want to do rentals because they thought it oversaturated their model lineup. And they weren't lying. But in order to remain competitive and to give customers a taste of what you're producing, the rental car companies ended up becoming more of a precursor to the buying experience, because if you could get people to experience your brand, it would create some level of awareness. These car companies lost a lot of money on producing these cars because they couldn't actually sell them. And in order to get them back from the rental car companies, they had to be sold. So it is just an absolute mess of how these car companies and these rental car companies are intertwined. Now, Ford ended up selling their shares, and General Motors has a very small stake in Hertz, and they all have their hands in everything. Now, in Chrysler in particular, so Chrysler decided to take on thrifty rentals. And because Chrysler took on thrifty rentals, Lee Iacocca was like, hey, we need to make this work. And the Jeeps and the Chryslers and the Dodges also were pushed into the fleets because it made more sense for them to do that, to be able to compete with Ford and General Motors. Now, in today's world, one of the worst things that happened to the automotive industry is the electrification of it all. This is purely an opinion, but I think that when Hertz took on the Tesla fleet, they were thinking something similar that the guys back then, because they made a lot of money doing those rental cars back then. And I mean pre-60s, 70s. And the 70s and 80s is a bit wonky for the rental car company, but back then they made a load of money. Today, no, absolutely not. And the pandemic did not help the rental car companies, but Tesla gave a proposal of self-driving and electrification and making it beneficial, especially for the Uber and Lyft drivers, which in theory sounds great, but in application is absolutely horrible. I've done it. I had a Chevy Bolt EUV that I rented from Uber for about 4 months. And the charging experience, because I don't own a home, was the absolute worst. And for all of you that are considering an electric vehicle, definitely rent one before you buy one, because then it'll give you real-time experience of what it's like to own one. But the tale is as old as time is when Tesla decided to propose a fleet of electric vehicles as a way of garnering interest in electric vehicles. Well, it turns out that they ended up holding the bag, and they had to pretty much liquidate and offload a lot of the Teslas that were there to basically recoup. And they lost and burned a lot of money. And the only reason why is because, if you don't know, Elon and the Tesla brand controls a lot of the EV market, and it's almost brilliant in the way that he did it, because the rental cars were supposed to be, they've always been the guinea pigs for a lot of the car companies in their fleets, but Elon sold them a dream and now they're left holding the bag. But the whole point of this video is just the curious history about it, and how we don't even realize that a lot of the things that we experience today during travel and during, rental cars, and how all those things were set up was because it was essentially a solution to a problem. And I know that's like very obvious business 101, but this was because of a solution to a problem. And had that man never broke down, I don't know if we would have ever gotten rental car companies the way that we have them today. But you guys in the comments below, let me know if you knew any of this, because I was very shook when I found out that a lot of the rental car stuff that we experience today is because one man basically said, I'm sick of this shit and I need a car. I guess that does make sense. But with that being said, until the next video, I will see you guys later.